Let's see. والأشكال أربعة لأن الحد الأوسط إن كان محمولا في الصغرى وموضوعا في الكبرى وهو الشكل الأول، وإن كان بالعكس فهو الرابع، وإن كان موضوعا فيهما فهو الثالث، وإن محمولا فيهما فهو الثاني. فهذه هي الأشكال الأربعة المذكورة في المنطق. So the syllogism is it's basically the way we reason. We don't necessarily do it with all the steps there, but all arguments will basically have this fundamental design by nature. And so what he's saying is that the figure, there are four figures in mantiq. And if you and this is the way I learned it, but if you go MP, write it down, MP, PM, so map PAM, and then do that again on one column, MP, PM, MP, PM. And then under the first one put SM, the second one put SM, the third one put MS, and the fourth one put MS. So this is basically how these ashkal work. Because what you're looking at is you have a major term, a minor term, and a middle term, right? Because every syllogism can only have 3 terms. That's a law. If you have 4 terms, it's a fallacy. And so when you look at the P is your major term. That's called the predicate. It's your major term. Why? Because the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. You can only know the major term when you do your when you find your conclusion. All right? The major term is going to be the predicate of the conclusion, and the minor term, which is the S, is the subject of the conclusion. All right? So you have in the first one you have the middle term, and then you have the major term, and then you have the minor term, and then you have the middle term. Got that? The first one. So it's MP, SM. The middle term has to be repeated twice. It has to be in both premises. If it's not, it's not a sound syllogism. It has to be in both. So that's the first. That's the first type. All right, and so there are 4 figures for if the middle term is the predicate of the minor premise and the subject of the major premise, right? So he's explained what the middle term is, the predicate of the minor premise and the subject of the major premise. The form is the first figure, all right? Shakl al-awwal. It's called a shakl in Arabic. The opposite is the 4th figure. Okay, so that's the opposite. If it is the subject of both, the form is the 3rd, and if it is the predicate of both, the form is the 2nd. These then are the 4 figures of a syllogism in logic. Now, these figures then, okay, so والشكل الثاني منها يرتد إلى الأول بعكس الكبرى، والثالث يرتد إليه بعكس الصغرى، والرابع يرتد إليه بعكس الترتيب أو بعكس المقدمتين جميعا، والكامل البين الإنتاج هو الأول. So Aristotle believed that the first figure was the ideal figure, because he said that it was a perfect syllogism, and the other three were imperfect. And some of them don't even, like Imam al-Ghazali doesn't even include the fourth figure in his Qistas al-Mustaqim. He gives 5 scales, and it's basically the first 3 figures, and then the conjunctive and disjunctive conditionals. Those are the scales that he says are the true Quranic scales for knowledge. So one of the things that Aristotle then, in order to get to this perfect syllogism, you had to reduce arguments. And reduction, that's why you learn conversion, aversion, contraposition. These are ways of taking propositions and putting them into forms that you can put into that first figure. So this is the ideal when you do that. And like I said, we can't, this course, we just don't have time. But my hope, again, is that your interest is piqued enough that you will want to pursue this as a subject, because it's worth pursuing. And again, our scholars were very committed to it, and it's just, our tradition is replete with examples from this science, as well as Western tradition. If you read any serious Western works, you're going to recognize pretty quickly that they all studied logic. I mean, any of the nonfiction works of, you know, if you read Hume, if you read Locke, if you read Mill, any of these writers that you will see, and certainly the earlier ones, St. Thomas, they're all working with this science. So that's very important to keep in mind. So reducing is basically, it's taking a syllogism, one type, and turning it into another type. And so he's going to go into the وَالشَّكْلُ الرَّابِعُ مِنْهَا بَعِيدٌ عَنَ الطَّبْعِ جِدًّا. So he's saying the fourth figure is very unnatural, which is where you have a it's a universal negative in the first premise, and then a positive particular in the second, and a negative particular in the third. That's the fourth one, and he's saying that that's a very unnatural type of syllogism. So it's one that, I mean, if you look, see, the nice thing about learning the system also is the syllogisms, because there's 4 figures, and then the way that you can mix them up, right, is 16, and then with the moods you get up to 64. So there are actually 64 possible types of syllogism, but out of those 64, only 19 of them are valid forms. And from those 19, only 12 really come out as being useful. So once you learn that, you can analyze quickly by just identifying the major term, identifying the minor term, identifying the middle term, and then you can analyze the argument very quickly and determine whether or not it's a sound argument. And there's ways of doing that. There's basically 4 techniques that have been, there are 4 ways of doing that. The first one is Aristotle's method, which is through he had 6 things that were necessary. And if those 6 things, and if there was a breach in any one of those 6 things, then it was invalid as a syllogism. And the second way is the Euler there's two logicians that designed ways of determining whether a syllogism was sound through circles and diagrams. So that's another way. It's not that hard to learn. It's just basically, you have a subject and a predicate. All men are mortal. So you have mortal is your big circle, and then inside that is the men, because all men are mortal. There's other things that are mortal, right? Because in the first one it's distributed, in the second one it's undistributed, right? Which is, in other words, when we say all men are mortal, it doesn't mean all mortals are men, right? Because that's not convertible. You can't convert a universal positive. So those are another two ways. And then the final way is a way that was developed by the medieval scholastics, which is basically learning a mnemonic device, and then you can determine. So for instance, in the first figure, which is the MP SM, right? That's the first figure. So the major, the middle term is the subject of the first premise, and then the major term is the predicate, and then in the second one the minor term is the subject, and the middle term is the predicate. All right, so that's in that first figure. There's basically you have the ideal one is called Barbara. All right, he's going to go into these, I think, in the next. So let me just. والشكل الأول هو الذي جعل معيارا للعلوم. So the first figure, so he says, the one who has a sound intellect and an upright nature does not need to turn the second into the first. The second only yields a conclusion when the premises differ in affirmation and negation. So the first figure is the one that is considered a standard for various fields of study, so that we explain it here for it to serve as a template, and so the aim may be derived. So ضروبه المنتجة أربعة. So its valid moods, ضروب, that yield a conclusion are four. الأول كقولنا كل جسم مؤلف وكل مؤلف محدث وكل جسم محدث فكل جسم محدث. والثاني كقولنا كل جسم مؤلف ولا شيء من المؤلف بقديم فلا شيء من الجسم بقديم. والثالث كقولنا بعض الجسم مؤلف وكل مؤلف حادث وبعض الجسم حادث. والرابع كقولنا بعض الجسم مؤلف ولا شيء من المؤلف بقديم فبعض الجسم ليس بقديم. So these are the four moods of the first shekel. These are ideal for Aristotle. So all of the other, in your other three figures, they can be reduced to one of these four, all right, to get a perfect, more ideal. Now his favorite one was called Barbara, and this is a Latin term. Barbara it has three A's, so the voweling is Barbara, right? A. So this is called an AAA. So it has all of the propositions, including the two premises, which are also called the antecedent, and then the consequent, which is the conclusion. The two premises are both universal statements. And remember, a singular statement in logic is considered a universal. So if I say all men are mortal, that's an A statement, right? And then I say Socrates is a man, that's an A statement. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, that's an A statement. So that's called a Barbara. And that's the ideal one. And that's a valid. Now remember, you have formal logic and you have informal logic. In formal logic, you can have something that is logically valid, but it's still not true. So if I do this, I can say, all all cats are divine, right? That's an A statement. All cats are divine. My cat Tippy is a cat. Therefore, Tippy is divine. That is logically valid. But remember, you can have a valid syllogism, but the propositions aren't true. Because what do we have to have in order for it to be absolutely true statement? We have to have clear terms, we have to have true propositions, and we have to have a valid reasoning. So you can have valid reasoning without true propositions, and you can have true propositions without clear terms, right? So it's important, you have to have all three. So that's an example of the first one, Barbara. The second one is called Celorent. Celorent, C-E-L-A-R-E-N-T. Celorent has an E, an A, and then an E. All right? So every physical body is composed. Nothing is composed is pre-eternal, hence no physical body is pre-eternal. Now the way that would be in Celorent would be nothing that is composed is pre-eternal. So there's your E statement. Every physical body is composed, right? There's your A statement. Therefore, no physical body is pre-eternal. There's your E statement. You got that? So that's the Celorent. Celorent. That's the second figure. And then the third one is called Darii, D-A-R-I-I. And that has a universal and then two particular positive statements, two I statements. All right? So the third valid mood is some physical bodies are composed. Every composed thing is temporal. Hence, some physical bodies are temporal. So the way we would put that in a Darii would be every composed thing is temporal. Some physical bodies are composed. Some physical bodies are temporal. Do you see that? And then the fourth valid mood is some physical bodies are composed and nothing that is composed is pre-eternal. Hence, some physical bodies are not pre-eternal. And that's Verio. That's the last one. So that would be E I O. Now, to put that in a pure Verio, it would be nothing that is composed is pre-eternal. Some physical bodies are composed. Hence, some physical bodies are not pre-eternal. So the middle term is repeated twice, which in that case is what? Composed, right? And so what's the major term? Good, pre-eternal, right? Because it's the predicate. The major term is the predicate of the conclusion. The minor term is the subject of the conclusion. So some physical bodies is the minor term. The major term is pre-eternal. So those are those are called the moods of the first figure. And again, those are the ones that, those are the ones that he wanted to do. And then, so then he says, وَالِقْتِرَانِ إِمَّا مُرَكَّبٌ مِّنْ حَمْرِيَتَيْن كَمَا مَرَّ. So a categorical syllogism is either composed of two categorical propositions as explained above. وإما من متصلتين كقولنا إن كانت الشمس طالعة فالنهار موجود وكلما كان النهار موجودا فالأرض مضيئة ينتج إن كانت الشمس طالعة فالأرض مضيئة. Or of two conjunctive conditional propositions like our statement, if the sun has risen then daylight is present, and whenever daylight is present the earth is illuminated, which yields if the sun has risen the earth is illuminated. وَإِمَّا مُرَكَّبٌ مِّن مُنْفَصِلَتَيْنِ. So you have the conjunctive and the disjunctive, which are used, the more the disjunctive in the Quran is used. كَقَوْلِنَا كُلُّ عَدَدٍ فَهُوَ إِمَّا زَوْجٌ أَوْ فَرْدٌ وَكُلُّ زَوْجٍ فَهُوَ إِمَّا زَوْجُ الزَّوْجِ أَوْ زَوْجُ الْفَرْدِ ينتج من هاتين المقدمتين كل عدد فهو إما فرد أو زوج الزوج أو زوج الفرد. So, or of two disjunctive conditional propositions like our statement, every number is either even or odd, and every even number is either a pair of even numbers or a pair of odd numbers, which yields from these two propositions, every number is either odd, a pair of even numbers, or a pair of odd numbers. So the way that you would determine the way that Aristotle, and this is the medieval scholastic one, it's a little cumbersome, but it's actually for reducing, I think it's better, even though Kreft kind of he just says it's a historical curiosity. I don't totally agree with him. I think it's actually a really useful tool, because what you can determine immediately, see, if you know that there's a negative premise, then it has to be negative, the conclusion. Cannot have a negative premise and a positive conclusion. So if you have O or E, like Verio, right? Boom, it's a negative conclusion. It just tells you immediately that form is a negative conclusion. If you have, like Darii, if you have a particular, then the conclusion has to be particular. So if there's a particular in the premise, the conclusion has to be particular, right? So in terms of the rules that Aristotle laid out, the first two have to do with the form itself. It has to have 3 terms and only 3 terms. And it has to have 3 propositions. When there's more than 3 terms, in other words, you use an equivocal term, then it's the fallacy of 4 terms. It has sometimes ambiguity, amphibly, something. So that's a really important rule. And a lot of mistakes are made from that, ignoring that rule, because when you talk about, if you talk about, if you use a word, you have to use it with the same meaning in both of your premises, right? The term has to have the same meaning, right? And remember the comprehension of what it is. Once the term is defined, then that is going to tell you what it is. So if you talk about liberty, if you're talking about political liberty in one term and then spiritual liberty in another term, right, then obviously you're going to have confusion. It's not going to be a valid way of reasoning. And so 3 terms, 3 propositions, it has to have 3 propositions only. And then the middle term, which is the M, the middle term has to be distributed at least once. So it has to be the subject of a positive statement, or it has to be the predicate of a negative statement, universal. So it has to be distributed. And you get in, this is the fallacy of the undistributed middle. It happens a lot. So I'll give you an example of that. If I say, all animals, all ruminants are animals, right? Birds are not ruminants, right? Therefore, birds are not animals. All ruminants are animals. Birds are not ruminants. Therefore, birds are not animals. Right? So what's the problem with that? What's that? Identify it, though, in the actual syllogism. Where's the problem? What's that? So all ruminants are animals. That's distributed. Yeah, exactly. So animals is an undistributed term. Why? Because in a universal positive statement, the predicate is undistributed, right? The subject is distributed. All ruminants are animals. You can't, the ox of it, the conversion is what? All animals are ruminants. So you can't say that, right? So animals is undistributed. It doesn't apply to all animals. So birds are not ruminants. So that you can't take from that, you can't conclude that birds are not animals. Right? Got that? So that's the undistributed middle, and that's a very common fallacy. And then also you can't have a term that actually, that was I think that's an undistributed. You can't have a term, yeah, that's actually another type of fallacy, because it's actually a fallacy where you can't have a term that is distributed. It's undistributed in the in one of the premises, and then it's distributed in the conclusion. Okay, so that's actually an example of that. The other one would be can't think of one right now, but so one of them is the problems of distribution is the middle term has to be distributed at least once. It has to. So you have to have a middle term that is either a subject of a universal statement, or it's a predicate of a negative statement, universal negative. So that's a distributed middle. You have to have the distributed middle somewhere, because what is what's the foremost rule of the syllogism? What's it based on? What's that? What's it based on? The number one rule. Remember, I did the 6 rules that. That's the second rule. Yeah, that's the second rule. What was the first one? It's the great insight of, it's the E equals MC squared of Aristotle. It's the dictum, right? Yeah, it's the dictum de omni et nullo. It's the all or nothing law. So the reason that we can reason is because what is said about a universal, right? So if I say something about a distributed term, then the same thing can be said about each thing that it refers to. That's the basis of logic. So you always have to have that middle term distributed in one of the premises, because what you're doing in that second law is you're showing that 2 things equal to a third thing are equal to each other, or 2 things, one being equal, right? Only one of them being equal to that third thing means that they're not equal to each other. So that's pretty much what you're doing in logic. It's those 2 fundamental principles. The first one is that law of all or nothing, and the second one is that common notion that 2 things equal to a third thing are equal to themselves. That's logic right there. And that's based on the 3 laws, the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle, right? Because when you say something about something, you're assuming that that thing is what it is. And then when you're saying, you know, that something is not that thing, then you're also assuming that a thing is not what it isn't, right? So it can't contradict itself. It can't be something. And then finally, it can't be both this or both that. It can't be A and not A. So that's the foundation. The whole thing is there in that. So you have to have a distributed middle in one of those premises in order for this thing to work, right? And then the second thing relates to you have to have, if you have a negative, then the conclusion has to be negative, right? So if you have a negative in the premises, then it has to have a negative conclusion. And then it cannot have two negatives in the premise. So those are the rules that Aristotle put forward. And if any of those rules are broken, then it's an invalid syllogism. That's pretty much it. And that is, the tricky thing is identifying. It's when terms are ambiguous. It's not always clear that they're ambiguous. The other ones just take practice. Seeing an undistributed fallacy or illicit major or illicit minor fallacy, those just take practice. And I would recommend, you know, if you pursue logic, the textbooks that deal with this, like Copy, has a lot of examples that you can practice on. And practice, you know, you just get better with, sorry, you just get better with practice. So he's got a lot of examples in his little commentary down here. So, any questions? I'm starting to fag a little bit. I apologize. So. Ramadan. Alhamdulillah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
You mentioned that the Prophet used syllogisms.
Yeah.
But throughout history, there have been some theologians who have said that syllogisms don't make sense. I think Bacon is one. He said that they don't make sense, and he came up with a different theory.
Yeah, induction.
Could you describe which one is better? If
Well, again, the reason they don't make sense to Bacon is because he was basically a nominalist. And once you accept nominalism, which, you know, is one way of viewing the world, they make generalizations, they don't make abstractions. So they differentiate between generalizations and abstractions. A generalization is you look at a bunch of things out there that in your mind they're all different, but you're making generalizations about them. Abstracting is saying, no, there's something common. There's a universal. There's one in many that I can pull out. And that's the basis of deductive reasoning and the syllogism. If you don't accept that, then the syllogism doesn't make sense. So it's one of those things where it's just like, you know, if you look at evolution, evolution is predicated on the assumption that the only acceptable explanation for anything is a natural explanation. That you cannot make a supernatural explanation and call it scientific. So if that's your assumption, then you're obviously, it's an atheistic assumption about the nature of the world. You're not going to conclude that God made the world because you're not accepting or allowing for that premise to ever be entertained in your mind, because it's a supernatural proposition. It's not a natural. So that's the same John Stuart Mill was of the same opinion. I mean, Bacon was the first one. And Bacon, Francis Bacon, you know, bacon, what can I say? You know, Muslims don't like bacon. Yeah, I mean, he was a really weird guy. He was an occultist. He was heavily into, you know, very weird things. So, I mean, that's an ad hominem attack, and when you learn logical fallacies, yeah. But ad hominems are useful. Yeah. So.
I think that's all the time we have today for questions.
Okay, I appreciate that. How are you people? Is it starting to kind of, you know, Madiha, who studied? Where's Madiha? Yeah, okay. Madiha studied at Zaytuna, and when I told the story in the beginning about the man. He went to the teacher and he studied logic and they completed it and he said, go to the suq and then come back. Nothing happened. He said, we got to do it again. On the third time, he comes running back. Oh my God, Shaykh, you can't believe it. They're all using logic in the marketplace. Khalas, he knew, he got it. It just takes time, right? Don't you agree? Yeah. But it's very interesting and it's very useful and it really does help, you know, anybody that gets a firm grasp of this science is a very formidable, intellectually, you know, very formidable. And unfortunately, you know, Muslims have, I mean, I'll give you an example. Shaykh Muḥammad al-Shinqiti, who wrote Adwa al-Bayan, he was a great Mauritanian scholar, really brilliant scholar. And he inclined towards the Salafi position. He lived in Medina. But he was a master of logic. I mean, just a total master of logic. And he actually wrote a book on logic, and even though you know, they don't really permit logic in their teaching curriculum there, but he wrote it under a different name. So it's basically a book on logic, but he just didn't call it logic. Because he really felt like in order to understand usul al-fiqh and other sciences in Islam, you really have to have a knowledge of this, because that's what all the ulama were working with. But anyway, I heard from his son told me that he was there at the Masjid al-Nabawi, and one of the Shia scholars, who the Shias are, that's all they study in Qom. I mean, they really learn logic very well. And that's not all they study, but that was hyperbole. They study logic a lot. The Turkish scholars study logic a lot. They're really, really well grounded in logic. But he said that this Shia scholar was running rings around one of the ulama there in Medina. He was a Saudi scholar. And he was really confusing him. And he was making him say things, and through logic, he was just winning this debate with him about whether Sunni or Shia was the... So Shaykh Muhammad al-Amin came up and sat down, and he joined in. And because he knew logic so well, he started like, you know, it's like chess masters, right? Because, you know, you play chess with a chess master. If you don't know chess, it's literally 3 moves, and he's saying checkmate. And you're like, what happened? You know, because you can get checkmate in like 3 or 4 moves. So that's an example of just where somebody who was skilled in that. And also, Faridun's gone, but his teacher, Dr. Barakat, is a really wonderful man. He's a scholar from Afghanistan, and he studied in the traditional Afghani madrasa system. So he had to do the ISAGOGE, and he had to do the Shamsiya, and he really knows logic, and it's all just rote memorization. And he told me that when the communists started coming into Afghanistan, the only people that could debate with them were the ulama that were trained in logic. because the communists were all using these fallacies, and it was only the ulama that knew that traditional. And he said that they used to have debates with them, and they would just show how flimsy their arguments were. So this is not a theoretical, this is an art and a science. It has a theoretical component, but it's also a science. It has real practical application. And that's why, to learn it really well, I mean, over the years, I've just seen how formidable Shaykh Abdullah bin Bayya is in his reasoning. And he's spent a lot of time, because usul al-fiqh is, I mean, he's an ocean in knowledge generally, but usul al-fiqh is his main area of focus over the years, because he's taught it, he's written on it. But, mashallah, I mean, he's tafsir, qira'at, lugha al-Arabiyya, hadith wala haraj. He's just amazing in Arabic. And he learns something really quickly. He also knows French really well. I gave him a couple of really interesting books on French logic, written by French writers that I like. But, I've just seen that his knowledge of logic has, I mean, he gave an incredible talk in Spain. Some of you might have been there. He gave it on the 4 Aristotelian causes and related that to usul al-fiqh. And it was an amazing way of looking at usul al-fiqh. So, when you hear him talk, you'll hear him using all this terminology. And, al-qawl al-sharih. I mean, he's involved now in tahqiq al-manat. What he's saying, he said to me several times, one of the problems that he finds is that the ulama don't know logic anymore. So it's really difficult for them to deal with a lot of the problems that need, for instance, definitions. If you don't know how to define something, it's a problem. And before you can, al-hukmu ala shay'in fara'na an tasawwurihi, you have to conceptualize something. Conceptualization enables you to define it, and then once you've defined it, you can make a judgment about it. So, he's saying that tasawwarat now are, people don't have sound conceptualizations of a lot of the problems. Anyway, we should pray. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.